Claire Monroe had never imagined that a single moment could shatter her reality so completely. It was a typical Tuesday morning, and she had just finished her routine of drinking coffee and scrolling through emails, ready to meet David for lunch. Her life was everything she had ever dreamed of. A beautiful home in a suburban neighborhood, a loving husband, and the excitement of finally being pregnant after years of trying. After 4 long years of longing for a child, she was finally going to become a mother. The sun streamed through the window, casting a warm golden glow over the house as Claire stood by the sink, her phone in hand. She had just taken the pregnancy test a few moments ago, and there, in bold pink lines, was the confirmation. 2 lines. She felt a rush of joy, her heart pounding with excitement. The feeling was indescribable. She grinned to herself, imagining the look on David's face when he saw it. David is going to be over the moon, she whispered to herself, her voice barely above a breath as she sent him a text, attaching a photo of the test. It was a small moment, but it felt like the beginning of everything she had been waiting for. As she stepped outside into her car, her mind raced ahead. What would their baby be like? Would it be a boy or a girl? She couldn't wait to tell him. This was the moment everything was supposed to come together. Her life felt like it was about to change for the better in the most wonderful way. But life had other plans. As Claire drove to meet David for lunch, she thought about how much things had changed since their wedding day. At that time, David had promised her a family, a home, and happiness. And for years, they had worked hard together to make that dream a reality. David was a driven man, a marketing executive with a successful career at a well-known company, but he was always good about making time for their relationship. Or so Claire thought. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sharp screeching sound. A truck barreled out of nowhere, swerving across the intersection, and before Claire could even react, the world around her turned into chaos. The impact was deafening. Metal scraping against metal, glass shattering, and her car spinning wildly out of control. For a brief moment, time seemed to slow down as she gripped the steering wheel, her breath caught in her throat. In the midst of the confusion, one thought dominated her mind. Protect the phone. She couldn't let David miss seeing the news. That photo of the pregnancy test needed to reach him. The car finally came to a halt, spinning to a stop against the sidewalk. Her head slammed against the window. The warmth of blood trickled down her neck, and she couldn't feel her face. A sharp pain radiated through her, but everything felt distant. The world around her was a blur, and she heard faint voices, screams, calls for help. The world spun, and then everything went black. When Claire opened her eyes again, it was in a sterile, white hospital room. The beeping of machines was the first sound she recognized. She turned her head slowly, only to see David slouched in a chair beside her, his face unshaven, eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. "David!" Claire whispered weakly, trying to lift her hand toward him, but her arm felt like it was made of stone. Her body was heavy and unresponsive, the pain too much to bear. David jerked awake, his eyes locking onto hers. His expression, however, didn't reflect the relief she had hoped for. There was something in his gaze, something cold and unreadable. It made her stomach twist in knots. It was as if the David she knew was no longer there. "Claire," he said softly, his voice hoarse. He reached out and squeezed her hand, but his touch felt distant, as if he were unsure of how to comfort her. "You had us all worried." Claire tried to smile, but her face didn't feel like her own. It was stiff, as though her facial muscles no longer remembered how to express emotion. "The baby," Claire croaked, the words barely escaping her lips. David's grip tightened around her hand, but there was no warmth in it. His voice trembled slightly. "I'm so sorry, Claire. The doctors. They did everything they could." Claire's mind went blank. The baby. Her baby. The one thing she had been waiting for, hoping for, all these years, was gone. She closed her eyes, feeling a wave of nausea wash over her as the reality hit her. The world felt like it was closing in on her, and nothing made sense anymore. The door opened, and Claire recognized the familiar scent of her mother-in-law, Vivian Hayes, before her voice cut through the silence. "David, honey, the doctor needs to talk to you," Vivian said gently, but her tone was clinical, as if she were discussing a simple business matter, not the tragic loss of a child. David nodded without a word, giving Claire's hand one last squeeze before standing up. "I'll be right back," he said. His voice lacked any real emotion, as if he was more concerned about the upcoming conversation than his wife's state. Claire's eyes remained closed, but her mind was racing. She could hear their muffled voices through the partially open door. Vivian's voice was high-pitched, overly sweet. "She's going to need a lot of surgeries," Vivian said, her voice tinged with concern, but also practicality. "We need to think about what's next." David's voice responded, low and strained. "I don't know if I can—" "Oh, darling, we'll figure it out," Vivian interrupted, her tone softening. "One step at a time." The words felt like a punch to Claire's gut. She wasn't a project to fix. She wasn't a problem to solve. She was a person, a wife, a woman, and someone who had just lost everything she had ever wanted. Tears slid silently down Claire's face, staining the pillow beneath her head. She didn't know it yet, but in that moment, the Claire who had once been full of hope, love, and optimism was slipping away. Something darker, colder, was beginning to take her place. Claire spent the following days drifting in and out of consciousness, each time waking up feeling like she had been hit by a truck, both literally and figuratively. The pain from the accident was unbearable, but the emotional toll was worse. Every time she opened her eyes, she saw David sitting beside her, his presence a constant reminder of the betrayal that had already begun to settle in her heart. The hospital room, with its sterile smell and buzzing machines, felt like a tomb. It was as though time had stopped, leaving her suspended in a world that was no longer hers. Her face was unrecognizable, the swelling and bandages making her feel like a stranger in her own skin. Every day, the doctors came in to assess her injuries, but no one ever spoke of the loss. It was as though the baby had never existed. The silence surrounding the death of her child was suffocating. David didn't mention it, and neither did Vivian, his ever-present mother, who would stop by every day, her face carefully masked with a practiced smile. One afternoon, after yet another failed attempt to speak, Claire felt a sharp pang of frustration. She wanted to scream, to tell them how angry she was, how betrayed she felt, but all she could manage was a soft, broken whisper. The emotional numbness had begun to settle in, but there was a spark inside her, an ember of rage and determination that refused to be extinguished. David was different now. The man who had once been the love of her life, the person she shared her dreams with, now seemed like a distant figure. He spent more time talking to his colleagues on the phone, his business meetings, and less time looking at her, really looking at her. Claire had noticed it from the beginning, how he avoided making eye contact, how he wouldn't touch her unless it was necessary, and how he'd act as though the accident, and everything that had happened, hadn't shaken him. He had returned to work almost immediately, leaving Claire alone in the hospital room. The only times he was truly present were when Vivian was around. His mother, always the tactician, seemed to have a plan for everything, including Claire's recovery. The nights were the worst. It was in the stillness of the hospital room that Claire felt most alone, abandoned in her grief and pain. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of physical therapy, Claire was exhausted but unable to sleep. She stared at the ceiling, the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor echoing in the otherwise silent room. A soft knock at the door startled her, and before she could respond, it creaked open. "Claire?" David's voice was quiet, uncertain. Claire turned her head, her eyes meeting his. He stood in the doorway, looking tired and disheveled, his dark circles under his eyes a testament to his sleepless nights. He looked worn out, but not from the accident. No, this exhaustion felt different. It felt like emotional distance, like he was carrying the weight of something he wasn't willing to share. "I brought you some food," he said, his voice strained. He held a tray with a small bowl of soup and some crackers. The gesture, so ordinary, felt out of place in the face of what had happened. Claire couldn't bring herself to respond. She didn't want to eat, didn't want to speak. She just wanted him to leave, to stop pretending like everything was fine. David set the tray down on the bedside table, his eyes darting between the bandages on her face and her eyes. He reached out, as if to touch her hand, but stopped midway, his hesitation clear. The silence between them grew heavy. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know I should have been here more." Claire wanted to shout at him, to tell him how much his absence had hurt, but instead, she simply turned her head away. It was easier that way. Easier to keep the growing bitterness inside her, where he couldn't see it. She had learned to hide her emotions well over the years, but now it was becoming harder and harder to keep up the facade. I don't know what to do," David continued, his voice cracking. "Everything is falling apart, Claire. I don't know how to fix this. I don't even know how to fix me." Claire's eyes flicked toward him. There it was. The truth. He didn't know how to fix anything, least of all himself. He wasn't here because he cared for her. He was here because he felt responsible. His words were empty. He was trying to save face, to maintain the image of the perfect husband, the man who could always fix things. But Claire knew better now. She saw the cracks in his armor, the parts of him that had always been hidden from her. She didn't say anything. Instead, she closed her eyes and turned her head, letting the quietness consume her. David stood there for a moment, his shoulders slumping in defeat. Finally, with a deep sigh, he left the room, the sound of the door closing behind him echoing in her mind. Later that day, Claire found herself lying awake, staring at the ceiling, unable to escape the thoughts swirling in her head. It was then that she realized something that made her stomach churn. She had spent so long focusing on the pain of losing her child, on the way her body had been scarred, that she had missed the biggest betrayal of all. It wasn't just the accident. It wasn't just the loss of the baby. It was the way David had already moved on, leaving her to suffer in silence. The man who promised to be there for her, to support her, was already slipping away, consumed by his own guilt and fear. Claire wasn't sure when it happened, when she stopped being the center of David's world, when his love for her became a distant memory. But it was clear now. He wasn't the man she had married. He wasn't the man she thought she knew, and that realization hit her harder than anything else had. That night, as she lay there, Claire made a decision. She wouldn't let David or anyone else define her life. She had lost the baby, yes, but she still had the power to reclaim her future. She would find her strength again, even if it meant doing it on her own. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to happen overnight, but Claire was done being the victim. She would rise from the ashes of her pain, and when she did, she would show David, and the world, just how strong she really was. The days that followed Claire's decision were a blur. Her body ached, her spirit fractured, but something deep inside her refused to let the darkness consume her entirely. She wasn't sure what exactly had changed, but with each passing day, a shift occurred. Claire was no longer the passive victim of her circumstances. She was becoming something else, something stronger. She felt it in her bones, in the quiet moments when her mind cleared enough to think. For the first time in weeks, she looked at herself in the mirror without the layers of bandages that had concealed her scars. The woman staring back at her was different, but she still recognized the fire in her eyes. She wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. Claire spent days buried in her thoughts, trying to understand the full extent of the betrayal she had endured. She knew David's behavior was odd, distant, but she hadn't fully realized how deep it ran until that night when she overheard him talking on the phone. She had been lying in bed, trying to rest, when his voice, muffled by the door, piqued her curiosity. She had always been a quiet listener, content to watch the world around her. But tonight, something in David's tone made her lean forward, straining to hear. "I can't keep doing this," David's voice cracked, sounding unusually vulnerable. It's just too much, Vivian. I can't look at her the same way anymore. She's different. It's not the same. It never will be. Claire's heart skipped a beat. Vivian? His mother? Why was he speaking to her about this? The conversation continued, and Claire's pulse quickened as the words sunk in. Look, I get it, David said, his voice lower now, as if speaking in a conspiratorial tone. She's in a bad spot, but I just can't be the one to fix her. I don't even know who she is anymore. She's changed. She doesn't need me, not like she used to. A sharp sting of betrayal lanced through Claire's chest. He wasn't talking about the accident. He wasn't talking about her physical pain or the loss of their child. He was talking about her as if she were a broken thing, a problem to be fixed. She sat frozen, listening to him, each word like a needle puncturing her heart. David, listen to me. Vivian's voice came through clearly, comforting yet calculating. You have to think about the future. Your future. What does it mean for your career, for the image you've worked so hard to build? If she can't recover, if she can't get back to the way she was, then maybe it's time to think about other options. She's not the same person, and she'll never be. People will talk, David. You can't afford for this to drag on. Claire's stomach twisted. It wasn't just David she had to worry about anymore. It was Vivian, too. Her mother-in-law, the woman who had never once treated her like a daughter, had been quietly pulling the strings all along. Claire had known Vivian was controlling, but hearing her manipulate David in such a cold, calculating way made her blood run cold. They weren't just worried about Claire's health, they were concerned about the impact of her condition on their reputation. Suddenly, everything became clear. David's avoidance wasn't just about him being overwhelmed, it was about him being ashamed. Ashamed of her. Ashamed of what had happened. It had never been about love. It had always been about appearances. The image of the perfect family, the perfect wife, the perfect future. And now that that image was shattered, so was his commitment. Claire didn't sleep that night. Instead, she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. Her body might be broken, but her mind was sharp. The pain in her chest was nothing compared to the rage simmering beneath the surface. How dare they? How dare David speak to Vivian like that? How dare they treat her like a project to fix? She knew what she had to do next. She couldn't stay in this toxic environment any longer. She needed to take control back. She had to know the truth. The whole truth. She had to expose the lies, not just about her, but about everything that had been hidden from her. The next morning, Claire asked the nurse to help her sit up. Her body screamed in protest, but she ignored the pain. She needed clarity, and she knew that the first step in regaining control was understanding what had really happened. She had to find the pieces of the puzzle that David had left scattered around their lives. She couldn't wait for him to come clean. She would uncover the truth herself. When the nurse left the room, Claire pulled herself out of bed. Her legs wobbled at first, but she steadied herself, using the walls to guide her. She made her way to the desk in the corner of the room, where she had noticed David's phone earlier. It was unlocked, lying carelessly on the table, as if it didn't matter anymore, as if he had nothing to hide. She took a deep breath, gathering her courage, and picked up the phone. She scrolled through the messages, her eyes scanning quickly until a name caught her eye. Sarah. The messages between David and Sarah were frequent, casual at first, but as she read further, Claire felt her heart plummet. There were dozens of texts about meeting up, about sneaking around behind her back. The last message sent the night of the accident made Claire's blood run cold. I can't believe she's pregnant. That's just going to complicate everything. There it was. The truth she had been searching for. David had known about the pregnancy, and he hadn't been supportive. He had been angry. Claire's grip on the phone tightened. She didn't need to read anymore. She had all the proof she needed. Her mind raced with the implications of what she had just discovered. David had been seeing someone else. Not only had he been unfaithful, but he had orchestrated everything. His own actions, the accident, the lies, the betrayal. He had never been the man she thought he was. Claire stumbled back to the bed, feeling dizzy from the revelations. This wasn't just about the baby anymore. This was about her life, her identity. She couldn't continue to live like this, trapped in a web of lies, pretending that everything would go back to normal. She would take control. She would expose David and Vivian for the manipulative people they were. She would heal, not just physically, but emotionally. Claire Monroe was done being the victim. She had been broken, yes, but now, it was time to rebuild. Claire knew the road ahead would be difficult. She would have to confront David, confront Vivian, and confront the parts of herself she had been avoiding for so long. But the fire inside her was burning brighter now than it had ever been. She would rise from this, not just for herself, but for the woman she had always wanted to be. Claire's world had shifted entirely in the past few days. The anger and betrayal she had once buried deep within her were now bubbling to the surface, raw and untamed. She couldn't ignore the truth any longer. The truth about David's infidelity, the truth about his indifference to her pain, and the truth about the life he had been living behind her back. What had started as a small crack in their marriage had become a gaping chasm, one that Claire now realized was impossible to bridge. She could no longer pretend that everything was fine. The woman in the mirror staring back at her wasn't the same person who had been eager to please David, who had desperately wanted to keep their marriage intact. No, this woman was fierce, determined, and angry. She wasn't just going to sit idly by while David continued to lie and manipulate her. She was going to fight back, to expose him and everything he had done. But where to begin? Claire needed more than just the messages she had found on David's phone. She needed a plan, something solid, something that would leave no room for doubt when she confronted him. She needed to know the extent of his betrayal, the lengths to which he had gone to hide the truth from her. She needed to make him face his actions, to see how deep the damage ran. She knew David's work schedule like the back of her hand. He was a creature of habit, always following the same routine. He worked long hours, often late into the night, and his meetings were meticulously planned out. This was the one thing she could count on, his predictability. But it was also something she could use against him. Claire decided that she would confront him in a way he wouldn't expect. She wasn't going to wait for him to come to her, or for him to show any signs of remorse. She would take the initiative. She would drag the truth out of him, whether he liked it or not. The day after she made her decision, Claire called in a favor from a close friend of hers, Sarah, who worked in the same marketing firm as David. Claire had known Sarah for years. She was a kind woman, always willing to lend a hand, and Claire knew she could trust her. When Claire asked Sarah to meet her for coffee, the conversation that followed would mark the beginning of the end for David. "Claire, what's going on?" Sarah asked, concern lacing her voice as they sat down in a quiet cafe, away from the prying eyes of the office. "You sound different. Is everything okay?" Claire took a deep breath before speaking, her eyes meeting Sarah's with a newfound determination. "I need your help," Claire said, her voice steady but sharp. "I need to know everything about David. I need to know if you've seen anything, heard anything, anything that could explain why he's been acting so strange." Sarah's eyes widened in surprise, and for a moment she hesitated. Claire could see the conflict in her friend's eyes, the hesitation that told her Sarah knew more than she was letting on. After a beat, Sarah sighed and lowered her voice, glancing around to ensure they weren't being overheard. "Claire, I don't know how to tell you this," Sarah said quietly, her tone full of regret. "I've seen things I didn't want to believe were true. But now that you're asking, I can't keep quiet anymore." Claire's heart raced as Sarah continued, each word feeling like a slap to her already fragile sense of reality. "David, he's been seeing someone else. It's been going on for months. I didn't know how to bring it up, but I've seen him with her. She's been to the office several times, and he's always been so secretive about it. I don't think you know how deep this goes, Claire. It's not just a fling." Claire's stomach churned as the weight of Sarah's words hit her. She had known on some level that David wasn't the man he had once been, but hearing the truth, hearing it from someone she trusted, made it all the more real. The betrayal was no longer just an assumption. It was a fact. "Who is she?" Claire asked, her voice barely above a whisper, the anger threatening to boil over. Sarah hesitated for a moment before answering. "Her name is Megan. She works in the same department as David. She's charming, beautiful. But it's not just about looks. David has been talking to her for months. They've been planning things behind your back. I don't know the full story, but I'm afraid it's worse than you think." Claire felt like the world had been ripped from beneath her. David, the man she had loved, the man she had trusted, had been living a double life. He had betrayed her, not just emotionally, but with his actions. He had been lying to her, pretending to care, while carrying on an affair right under her nose. "Do you think he'll ever tell me?" Claire asked, her voice shaky, the hurt in her chest palpable. Sarah looked at her with sympathy, but her eyes held no hope. "I don't think so, Claire. He's too far gone. I've seen how he's been acting, how he avoids you, how he talks about you to others. He's already checked out. I'm sorry." Claire's world was falling apart in front of her, and yet, somewhere deep inside, a fire was beginning to burn. She was done. She was done being the victim. She was done living in the shadows of David's lies. She wouldn't let him destroy her any longer. "Thank you, Sarah," Claire said, her voice steady now, her mind already racing with the plan she was beginning to form. "I need to confront him. I need to hear it from him." Sarah nodded, a silent understanding passing between them. She knew this was a turning point for Claire. She was no longer the same woman who had quietly accepted her fate. Claire was reclaiming her life, and no one, not even David, could stand in her way. Later that evening, Claire waited for David to return home, her heart pounding in her chest. The moment of reckoning was fast approaching. She had no idea how he would react, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to back down. When the door clicked open and David walked in, Claire stood up from the couch. She had changed. She was no longer the wife who would forgive and forget. She was stronger now, and she was about to make him face the consequences of his actions. "David," she said, her voice calm but firm, "we need to talk." David stopped in his tracks, his eyes widening slightly at the tone in her voice. "What's going on, Claire?" he asked, his voice tinged with confusion. Claire didn't waste any time. "I know about Megan," she said, her eyes locking onto his. "I know everything. I know you've been seeing her behind my back. I know you've been lying to me. And I'm done." David's face paled as he opened his mouth to speak, but Claire held up a hand, silencing him. "You don't get to explain yourself," Claire continued, her voice now trembling with fury. "You've already said everything you need to say. I trusted you, David, and you destroyed me." David's gaze faltered as Claire stepped closer, her presence now commanding, unyielding. "I want a divorce," Claire said, her voice steady as she delivered the final blow. "And I want it now. Don't bother trying to explain. It's over." The days following Claire's confrontation with David were a whirlwind of emotion, confusion, and resolution. She felt as though she was walking through life in a daze, her mind still processing the weight of everything that had come to light. Her marriage, her life as she had known it, was over. She had made the decision to confront him, to demand the truth. And now, there was no turning back. But with every ounce of clarity, another part of her still struggled to understand how everything had gone so wrong. How had David, the man she had trusted above all others, become the very person she had despised? David's reaction to her demand for a divorce was not what she had expected. He had pleaded, of course, his voice shaky, his eyes filled with a mix of guilt and fear. But his pleading wasn't enough to break Claire's resolve. For too long, she had allowed herself to be the dutiful wife, the one who made excuses for him, who forgave his transgressions. But now, standing before him, she felt a strength she had never known before. This was her life, and she wasn't going to let him destroy it anymore. Please, Claire, David had begged the night of their confrontation. You don't understand. I didn't want this. I never wanted to hurt you. I didn't mean for things to go this far. Claire had listened, her arms crossed over her chest, her gaze unwavering. She had heard all of it before, the empty apologies, the broken promises. But this time she wasn't going to fall for it. I trusted you, David, Claire said, her voice calm but firm, the words coming from deep within her. But you've betrayed me in ways I can never forgive. You've made me a fool, and I refuse to be that person anymore. I'm done. David's eyes had searched hers, his voice growing desperate. I know I've hurt you, and I'm sorry. But please don't leave me. We can fix this. We can go to therapy, work through it. We've been through so much together. Don't you dare tell me we can fix this, Claire had snapped, stepping forward, her anger bubbling to the surface. You've been lying to me for months, David. You've been living a double life, and I don't even know who you are anymore. This isn't about fixing anything. It's about moving on. David's face crumpled as he saw the finality in her eyes. He had always known that Claire was strong, but now, seeing her stand there, resolute and unyielding, he realized just how much he had taken her for granted. The woman who had loved him unconditionally was gone, and in her place stood someone who had learned the harshest lessons about betrayal and survival. I never meant to hurt you, David whispered, his voice breaking. I love you, Claire. I always have. But Claire had already turned away, her back to him, her heart hardened against the man who had once been everything to her. The love she had once felt for him had evaporated, replaced by a cold determination to take back control of her life. Claire knew that leaving David wasn't going to be easy. There was a house to sell, assets to divide, and the haunting question of how to rebuild her life from the rubble of her broken marriage. But she was determined. She had come to realize that she had spent far too many years living for someone else, living for David, living for the image of the perfect family. Now, it was time to live for herself. The next few weeks were a blur of paperwork, legal consultations, and the constant presence of Vivian, who had made it clear she had no intention of letting Claire slip away from the family without a fight. Vivian's interference had only made Claire more resolute. She had spent years being manipulated by Vivian, who had always treated her like an extension of David, never an individual. But now Claire wasn't afraid to stand up to her. One afternoon, when Vivian arrived at Claire's house to discuss the terms of the divorce, Claire had had enough. She had been patient, listening to Vivian's endless suggestions about what was best for David, what would protect the family's image. But Claire had no patience left for her manipulation. You don't get to tell me what's best for me, Vivian, Claire had said, her voice steady but sharp. You've spent my entire marriage telling me how to live, how to behave, and I'm done with it. I'm done with all of you. Vivian had stared at her, wide-eyed and stunned by the sudden shift in Claire's demeanor. For a moment, she looked like she might cry, but the tears never came. Instead, Vivian had straightened her shoulders and with a thin smile said, You think this is easy? You think you can just walk away from all of this and leave David with nothing? I'm not leaving him with nothing, Claire had retorted. I'm leaving him with his own choices. I'm leaving him with the mess he created. Vivian had no words in response. Instead, she had turned and walked out, her footsteps echoing in the silence that followed. Claire had never felt more empowered in her life, but despite her newfound strength, Claire knew that the hardest part was still ahead of her. She had to face David one last time, to finalize the divorce, to let go of the last remnants of the life she had once believed in. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't quick. But each day, Claire grew stronger. She found solace in the little things, taking long walks through the park, spending time with friends, and slowly rediscovering her passion for art, something she had abandoned in the chaos of her marriage. It was one such afternoon, a few weeks after her confrontation with David, when Claire received a message from Arthur Stern, the father of the man who had caused the accident. He had been a comforting presence in her life, offering support when no one else had. His words echoed in Claire's mind as she read the message. I know you're going through a lot, but I wanted to offer you something. There's a top-tier plastic surgeon I've spoken to. He can help you, Claire. It's not just about looks, it's about healing. You don't have to carry this burden forever. Claire thought about it for a moment. The thought of physical transformation had always seemed superficial, but now it felt like a new beginning. She wasn't just fixing her face, she was fixing her soul. For the first time in a long while, Claire felt a spark of hope flicker inside her. The following day, Claire made an appointment with the surgeon. The decision wasn't easy, but it felt like the next step in her healing process. She wasn't doing it for David or for anyone else. She was doing it for herself, to reclaim her life, her identity, and her sense of self-worth. She didn't know exactly what the future held, but she knew one thing. She wasn't going to let anyone define her anymore. As Claire walked into the surgeon's office for her consultation, she took a deep breath. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but it was hers to make. She wasn't just getting a new face. She was creating a new life, one that was all her own. And in that moment, Claire knew that she had finally begun the process of becoming the woman she was always meant to be. Claire's life had irrevocably changed. Every day since the moment she had walked away from David, her life had been one of constant reevaluation, painful self-discovery, and yet incredible growth. She had found a quiet strength that she hadn't known existed within her. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind, with legal documents, therapy, and, perhaps the hardest part of all, learning how to exist without the person who had once been the center of her world. It had been a long, painful journey, but Claire was beginning to piece herself back together, day by day, moment by moment. The surgery had been a success, but it wasn't just the physical changes that had given her the most comfort. It was the time spent alone in her thoughts, in silence, facing the consequences of her decisions. In the quiet of her apartment, she was able to feel her emotions without distraction, to allow herself the grace of mourning what she had lost, while also learning to embrace the woman she had become. Claire had always been a person who thrived in the chaos of life, in the noise and the distractions. She had worked tirelessly to be the perfect wife, the perfect partner, always putting David and his needs first. But that life was gone. The perfect marriage, the perfect family, it had all been an illusion. It was hard to let go of the dream she had held onto for so long, but Claire had realized that the dream had never really been hers. It had been a dream constructed by expectations, by society, and most of all, by David's desires. It was time for her to create her own dream. In the days that followed her surgery, Claire found solace in the simple things. She spent hours painting again, something she had abandoned when David's career had taken priority over hers. She had always loved painting, but it had seemed like a frivolous pursuit compared to the demands of her marriage. Now, with her heart raw and vulnerable, Claire poured herself into her art. Each brushstroke was a piece of her soul, each canvas a testament to her journey. One afternoon, as Claire was putting the final touches on a new painting, a portrait of a woman whose face was split in two, one side serene and beautiful, the other distorted with anguish, there was a knock at her door. She had learned to dread the knocks, knowing that they usually signified another conversation she wasn't ready for, but she opened the door anyway. Standing there, with his head hung low, was David. Claire felt an unexpected jolt in her chest. After weeks of not seeing him, of finally finding some peace, his presence had a profound effect on her. The man who had once meant everything to her now stood there, a shell of the person she remembered. His face was drawn, tired, and there was something in his eyes, regret, guilt, fear, that Claire hadn't seen in a long time. "Claire," David said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Can we talk?" Claire didn't answer right away. She stood in the doorway, staring at him, feeling a strange mix of emotions, anger, sadness, but also a sense of detachment. She had cried for him, begged for him to love her, And now, standing before her, he looked as though the love he once claimed to have had for her had disappeared as easily as it had come. "You've had your chance to talk, David," Claire replied, her voice steady, but her heart pounding. "What more is there to say?" David took a deep breath, as though steeling himself for the words he had to say. "I know I don't deserve a chance to explain, but I need you to hear me out. Please." Claire stared at him for a long moment, her mind racing. A part of her wanted to slam the door in his face, to tell him to go back to his perfect life with Megan, to never look back. But another part of her, the part that still carried a shred of the woman who had loved him, wanted to know the truth. She wanted him to tell her everything, to lay bare the reasons why he had destroyed their life together. "Come in," Claire finally said, stepping aside to let him enter. "But you'd better have a damn good explanation, David." He walked past her, his eyes on the ground, and she followed him into the living room. The familiar surroundings felt foreign now, a reminder of everything she had lost. Claire motioned for him to sit on the couch, but she remained standing, arms crossed, waiting for him to speak. "I don't know where to begin," David said, his voice tinged with shame. "I know what I did was unforgivable. I've betrayed you in ways that I can never take back. But I need you to know, I never meant for any of this to happen." Claire raised an eyebrow, her disbelief clear. "You never meant for it to happen? Do you think that's going to make it okay, David? Do you think I'm just going to forgive you because you didn't plan on betraying me? It's too late for excuses." David's face twisted in anguish. "I never meant for things to get this far. I was lost, Claire. I was so focused on my career and everything I thought I wanted that I ignored you. I ignored us. I thought that if I kept pretending everything was fine, it would be. But it wasn't. And when Megan came into my life, I didn't know how to stop." Claire's heart sank. She had heard enough. She had seen the proof. She didn't need him to tell her that he had been unfaithful. She already knew. What she needed to hear was why. And for the first time, it seemed as though David was truly trying to answer her. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he said quietly. "But I wanted you to know that I was broken too. And I realize now that I've broken you in the process. I've lost you, Claire, and that's the one thing I can't live with." Claire took a deep breath, feeling a mix of emotions swirl inside her. The anger that had burned so brightly just days ago now simmered down, replaced by something else. A hollow sadness. She wasn't sure if it was because of the person he had become, or because of the loss of the man she had once loved. "You're right," Claire said, her voice low but resolute. "You've lost me. But not because of Megan or the affair. You lost me because you stopped caring about me. You stopped seeing me as your partner. You saw me as someone to control, someone to manipulate. I'm not your project, David. I'm not your fixer-upper." David looked as though he might say something more, but Claire held up a hand, stopping him. "I don't need your apologies anymore. What I need is my life back," she continued. "And I'm done. I've already made my peace with this. You don't get to break me, David, not anymore." Sight. David didn't argue. He simply nodded, his face drawn with regret. "I'm sorry, Claire, truly." Claire didn't respond. She didn't need to. The words had already been said, and everything that needed to be said had been said. The man she had once loved, the man who had been her everything, was gone, and in his place was a broken stranger. She had done what she needed to do, and now it was time for her to walk away. As David left her apartment that evening, Claire felt a quiet sense of relief settle over her. It was over, and for the first time in a long time, she felt like she could finally breathe. She wasn't the same woman who had married David all those years ago. She was stronger, wiser, and ready to face the world on her own terms. And whatever came next, Claire knew one thing for sure. She was going to be just fine. It had been a few months since Claire had last seen David, and yet the memories of their life together still lingered like a cloud she couldn't quite shake. The pain had dulled somewhat over time, but the scars, both physical and emotional, remained. She had moved out of their home, leaving the memories of their once perfect life behind. She had sold the house and relocated to a small apartment in the city, far from the life she had once known. The change had been necessary, not just for the physical distance from David, but for her own mental and emotional well-being. Claire had learned that in order to heal, she had to sever all ties with the past. The man who had broken her, the family who had manipulated her, and the life she had tried so desperately to hold on to. Now, with each passing day, she felt herself growing stronger. The pain was still there, but it no longer defined her. She was no longer a victim. She was reclaiming her life. Her new apartment was a reflection of her transformation. Simple, bright, and filled with things that brought her peace. There were no reminders of David, no trace of the life they had shared. It was a space where she could truly be herself, a sanctuary where she could heal. And heal she did. Her art, something she had neglected for so many years, became her lifeline. Painting had always been Claire's passion, but it had taken a back seat to her marriage and the demands of her family. Now she poured herself into it, creating pieces that reflected her journey, her pain, her anger, and ultimately, her strength. Each canvas was a testament to her resilience. Claire knew that her work was changing. It wasn't just about creating pretty pictures anymore. It was about telling her story, about reclaiming her voice and her narrative. The more she painted, the more she realized that she was not just an artist. She was a storyteller, a woman who had lived through hardship and come out on the other side stronger than ever. One afternoon, as Claire worked on a new piece, a portrait of a woman emerging from a cloud of darkness into the light, there was a knock at the door. She wasn't expecting anyone, and for a moment, she felt her heart race in her chest. She had become accustomed to her solitude, to the quiet rhythm of her new life. But as she walked to the door and peered through the peephole, she froze. It was Arthur Stern, the father of the man who had caused her accident, the man who had helped her through the darkest days of her recovery. She had not seen him in weeks, not since their last conversation. He had been a pillar of support, someone who had quietly observed her struggle without pushing too hard. But now, standing at her doorstep, Claire couldn't help but wonder why he was there. She opened the door slowly, and Arthur smiled at her, his expression warm and familiar. "Claire?" he said, his voice kind. "Can we talk?" Claire hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to expect. But then, something about his presence, something gentle and reassuring, told her that he wasn't there to cause any more pain. He wasn't there to remind her of the past. He was there to help her move forward. "Of course," Claire said, stepping aside to let him in. Arthur entered her apartment, glancing around at the walls adorned with Claire's paintings. He stopped in front of one of her pieces, a painting of a woman with a face half hidden in shadow, the other half bathed in light. "You've come a long way, Claire," Arthur said, his voice soft with admiration. "This work is incredible. It's raw. It's honest." Claire smiled, but it wasn't a smile of pride. It was a smile of acknowledgement. It's my story," she said, her voice steady. "It's everything I've been through, everything I've learned." Arthur nodded, his eyes searching hers. "You've done something remarkable," he said. "You've taken your pain, your loss, and turned it into something beautiful. But there's something else I think you need to hear." Claire furrowed her brow, unsure of what he meant. "What do you mean?" Arthur took a deep breath, his eyes softening as he spoke. "Claire, you've been through so much. You've faced more than most people ever will. But I want you to understand that you don't have to do this alone. You don't have to carry this burden by yourself anymore." Claire blinked, surprised by his words. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Arthur took a step closer to her, his presence comforting, yet filled with quiet intensity. "I've watched you struggle, Claire. I've seen how you've closed yourself off from the world, from everyone who cares about you. But I want you to know that you don't have to be alone. You don't have to keep living in isolation." Claire's breath caught in her throat as she processed his words. She had spent so long focusing on herself, on her pain, that she hadn't stopped to consider what it meant to let others in. She hadn't realized how much she had shut herself off from the possibility of love, of connection, of something beyond the trauma she had endured. She had built walls so high around herself that even the most well-meaning people, like Arthur, had struggled to get through. And yet, there he was, standing in her apartment, offering her a chance to heal in a way she hadn't allowed herself to before. "You've been there for me, Arthur," Claire said softly, "but I don't know if I'm ready to let anyone in. Not yet. Maybe. Maybe not ever." Arthur nodded, understanding in his eyes. "I know, Claire. I'm not asking for you to rush. I'm not asking for you to jump into anything you're not ready for. But I want you to know that the possibility is there. The possibility of moving on, of healing, of letting go." Claire swallowed hard, her emotions threatening to overwhelm her. She had been so focused on her own healing, so focused on reclaiming her independence, that she had forgotten what it meant to truly let someone in. She wasn't sure if she was ready to open up to Arthur, to let him be a part of her healing process. But for the first time in months, she felt the stirring of something beyond her own pain. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was the possibility of a future where she wasn't defined by her past. "I don't know if I'm ready for that," Claire whispered, her voice shaky. "But I'll think about it." Arthur's smile was gentle and understanding. "Take all the time you need. But remember this, Claire. You deserve happiness. You deserve to feel loved, to feel whole. Don't let your past take that away from you." Claire nodded, her heart heavy but hopeful. "Thank you, Arthur," she said, her voice full of quiet gratitude. "I'll keep that in mind." Arthur gave her one last smile before turning to leave. As he walked out of the door, Claire stood there, staring at the empty space he had left behind. She wasn't ready for a relationship, for love, not yet. But she realized that Arthur had given her something far more valuable than advice. He had given her permission to heal, to move on, and to open herself up to the possibility of a future she had once thought was beyond her reach. She wasn't alone anymore. She had the strength to move forward, to rebuild her life from the ground up. She wasn't the woman she had been when she walked into this journey, but she was becoming someone new, someone stronger, more resilient, and ready to face whatever came next. For the first time in a long while, Claire felt at peace. And for the first time in years, she felt hope. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more emotional, real-life stories that inspire and empower, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an update. Your support means the world, and I can't wait to bring you more stories that will touch your heart and keep you coming back for more. Join our community of listeners who believe in the power of storytelling. Don't forget to like and share, and I'll see you in the next chapter.